Oh, come on, you knew it was going to be him. We're here to understand neoliberalism. We will understand what neoliberalism is, and because that has obviously a lot to do with power, at least at some point he was bound to show up. But what may come as a surprise, at least to some people, Foucault is not just going to be useful to us here because of his deep insights into power per se, but also, more to the point, when it comes to understanding neoliberalism. And so with his help, at the end of this video, you'll have a full understanding of what neoliberalism is, including its core. Because yes, there is a core. And a founding conference. I'm not even kidding. Which makes it all the more astonishing that the whole literature, including the academic literature, is full of statements and complaints about the fact that neoliberalism is an oft-invoked but ill-defined concept, or that neoliberalism is a slippery concept, that it is almost impossibly vague, oh my god, or that it is even a rascal concept, promiscuously pervasive, yet inconsistently defined, empirically imprecise, and frequently contested. Dude. In other words, although the term neoliberalism has been frequently used in recent decades, much analytical ambiguity continues to surround it, which actually shouldn't come as too big a surprise, seeing as the meaning of neoliberalism has attracted little scholarly attention. So on the one hand, there is no clarity whatsoever about what neoliberalism is or stands for, in spite of the fact that everybody's talking about neoliberalism. As we just heard, the term is promiscuously pervasive. Yet, on the other hand, there's little scholarly attention. And it gets worse because all of that would be one thing if we were talking about some confined issue like, I don't know, cold fusion. But as I probably and hopefully don't have to tell you, that is not the case here, because neoliberalism is the dominant ideology shaping our world today. Thanks for stating the obvious. And sure, that was written in 2005. You think things have changed in the meantime? Well, here's your answer. Neoliberalism is the dominant economic and social form that capitalism takes in the 21st century. In other words, as David doubles down here, neoliberalism survives as a hegemonic ideology. So that's where we're at. Everybody agrees we live in a neoliberal age, but nobody seems to know what that means. And actually, that's still not even the end of it, if you can believe it, because while that is certainly a deplorable scenario, it doesn't appear to be unique. Because, to give you just one other example that will turn out to be very relevant for us tonight, everybody also agrees that we live in a corporate age. Everybody is very familiar with the force with which the corporation has become a taken-for-granted feature of everyday life. Well said. And that has also been going on for a long time. Here's a classic for you. The American is controlled, livelihood and soul, by the large corporation. Jesus, look at that date. You think that has changed in the meantime? And yet, what is equally true to this day is that there is a great deal of deeply seated confusion about corporations, their origins, and true purpose. So by all means, at least on the surface, the fact that we live in a neoliberal world when no one understands what that means doesn't seem to be unique. When in fact, as we'll find out later tonight, when it comes to neoliberalism, it absolutely is. But for now, let's look at the last conspicuous aspect surrounding neoliberalism. Because with a term whose lack of clarity is so widely agreed upon, you wouldn't necessarily expect a slew of public statements all purporting to know what exactly neoliberalism is. And yet, that is precisely what's happening. And no, I'm not talking about some crypto bro on X or a guy on a bar stool. I'm talking about established institutional sources. A lot of them. And on top of that, all of their explanations as to what neoliberalism is go in the exact same direction. Namely, neoliberalism is the 20th century resurgence of 19th century ideas associated with economic liberalism and free market capitalism. That simple, huh? Who would have thought? Here's another one, the trusted Wikipedia page. Neoliberalism is a political and economic ideology that advocates for free market capitalism. I see. Here is the esteemed Cambridge Dictionary, which calls neoliberalism the policy of supporting a large amount of freedom for markets with little government control. Wow, that's an astounding degree of consistency for such a supposedly contested term. Here's another one from the official website of the Encyclopedia Britannica, which talks about a return to classical liberalism, which in its revived form came to be known as neoliberalism. So that's what neoliberalism is. It's just today's form of liberalism. Of course, I mean, it's in the name. Maybe all those scholars in academia who just told us how ill-defined the term is should take a look at the Wikipedia page. Or check out all those other sources we just looked at, because, like I said, there is a slew of them. And given the prominent status many of those sources enjoy, it shouldn't come as too big a surprise that this image of neoliberalism as some form of modern-day liberalism, of free market liberalism, that image is prevalent in the public discourse. Meaning neoliberalism has come to signify a radical form of market fundamentalism. So, at least according to The Guardian, we should be talking about neoliberalism, also known as market fundamentalism or laissez-faire economics. Again, those dusty academics should just pick up a newspaper every once in a while. But in all seriousness, that prevalence of the image of neoliberalism as free market liberalism, given the well-funded and omnipresent sources perpetuating it, is obviously very hard to outshine. I mean, you would need a real heavy hitter, someone who... Oh, well, I told you he was going to be back. And here he is, to nudge us in the right direction. Yes, there actually is a right direction. So, in the words of arguably the greatest power expert in modern times, in what could be described as the most consequential lecture series in modern times, neoliberalism should not be confused with the policy of laissez-faire, meaning liberalism, but, quite the contrary, should be perceived of as a call to perpetual interventions. Talk about a plot twist. Something tells me he didn't read the Wikipedia page. And indeed, as we'll find out soon, he actually read something else entirely. And so will we. Now, what Foucault just told us over time led to what has been described as the rediscovery of the origins of neoliberalism. And what became obvious in the process of that rediscovery is not just that Foucault is absolutely right in his analysis, but also that neoliberalism is one of the best defined ideologies, like ever, from its origin story to its content, all of it. And of course, the question at this point is, and can only be, this: how on earth is that possible? Any of it. Everything we'll be looking at tonight, including what Foucault just told us, all of that is out in the open, and has been out in the open for a century by now. And yet, everything we see when we look around are either statements bemoaning the supposed lack of clarity when it comes to neoliberalism, or some BS story about neoliberalism being the current-day free market liberalism. Why is the meaning of neoliberalism so clear, yet so obfuscated? And before we get to the former, trust me when I tell you, we have to talk about the latter. Because whether it's about neoliberalism or any other form of power analysis, any form of political theory, there are three things that have to be understood beforehand. They constitute somewhat of a necessary primer when it comes to power analysis, including regarding neoliberalism. Actually, neoliberalism is an excellent example in that regard. And those three things are behind this door, which is why, for a few short minutes, we have to go into this room. I do it on a regular basis as a refresher. It's never pleasant, to tell you the truth, but always useful and, as I mentioned, necessary. So let's buckle up, and here we go. Yeah, it's a little dark. It's literally a side room of the Backrooms. So let me get my flashlight. Whoa, Jesus. Don't worry, it's just a golden statue of Aristotle. I mean, I knew he was in here. I had just forgotten I left him so close to the door. So what Aristotle can tell us about point number one is this. When you do any form of power analysis, any form of political theory, there's going to be a point when that issue, that topic, becomes a singularity. You might remember that Aristotle called political science the queen of sciences. And the reason for that is not that political scientists would all be these brilliant and eloquent people. I mean, I'm a political scientist, so obviously not. The reason is that, unlike all other intellectual endeavors, there is no indifference on the part of your field of inquiry. No comet cares about a physicist watching it. No plant cares about a botanist documenting its growth. Language doesn't care about linguistics. Not a single member of the table of elements cares about chemistry, and so on. When you do power analysis, however, that changes. Let me put it this way. It's kind of like that scene in Blade Runner when the protagonist chases a replicant dressed like a doll into a room full of dolls. He looks at them one by one, and every time the look isn't reciprocated, because it's a doll. When he gets to the replicant, however, that changes. That look is a two-way street. That's what happens when you analyze power. It looks back at you. And while, even in this relatively abstract form, that is discomforting enough, it gets worse. Because point number 2, while that replicant is only standing in front of you, power is not. It's not just in front of us, it's all around us. Meaning trying to understand power has to be done from the inside. Just like Poe's protagonist, who has to analyze a vortex as it is dragging him down, analyzing power means doing it while being embedded in it, as it is being exerted over you. Put slightly differently, power as a medium, like every medium, according to Marshall McLuhan, is an environment, and we are surrounded by it, including and especially as we're analyzing it, while it is looking back at us. And while that vortex didn't construct itself, not consciously anyway, when it comes to the power environment that we're embedded in, that is a very different story. When we walk onto our field of inquiry, what awaits us is basically what the captain in Saving Private Ryan says on D-Day here. Every inch of this beach has been pre-sighted and preordained, I might add. And what pulls these 2 points together is that this power environment is specifically designed with our observing it in mind, meaning power isn't just looking back at us, it also appears to us in a highly contrived way. And that does not just go for the things that are visible to us, as you can imagine. Which brings us to our third point, and that concerns the things that, while very much being a part of our power environment, are still not visible to us. And yes, that's by design, of course, but there's a very important caveat here, and I think you'll understand its relevance for everything political pretty fast. All situations comprise an area of attention, figure, and a very much larger area of inattention, ground. So, in our curated power environment, some things are visible to us, translation, they are being shown to us, and some things are not, because they are not shown to us. McLuhan refers to the things we see as figure and the things we don't see as ground. But look at the way he introduces these terms with what he explicitly links the aspect of visibility. It is attention, not accessibility. And that's where the connection to the political discourse becomes obvious, all of it, frankly, because so many things that aren't immediately visible to us, in most cases, are still accessible. It just means they're still in the ground, the area of inattention. And while I do understand that you often don't know what you don't know, still, when the problem is inattention, that is a much lower bar to clear than inaccessibility, including when it comes to placing blame, because attention includes agency and responsibility. So inaccessible is on the people making it so. Inattentive is on me. What McLuhan calls ground here is not the underground, it's the background. And yes, if that background is far away, that may lead to invisibility, but all we have to do is move in closer. And in most cases, including this one, that is possible. What Foucault read before giving his lecture was obviously not inaccessible to him, or to us for that matter. It has literally been published for many decades with an ISBN, the kryptonite to every conspiracy theory. The hurdle here is attention, and that is not that hard to clear. And the reason it's vital to do just that in the case of any form of political theory or power analysis is that the medium of power, all around us, the environment that is power, affects us, including as observers, from the ground. Power is exceedingly good at hiding its own tracks and itself. And yet, all we need to do is pull it from the ground into the figure, the area of attention, which is exactly what we're going to do. So there you have it. Number 1, the lack of indifference on the part of our object of analysis when that object is power. Number 2, our own embeddedness in the power environment we're looking at. And thirdly, the silver lining, if you will, the fact that while that power environment acts on us from the ground, the background, that is, the area of inattention, the correct move is to shift our attention to the ground and thereby pull it into the figure. And as I just said, when it comes to neoliberalism, all 3 points will turn out to be highly relevant. How relevant, you ask? Well, let's just say that trying to understand neoliberalism without taking them into account leads to the sad state of the public discourse we just looked at. So, yeah. But the good news is that's not going to happen to us as we make our way back to the uplifting liminal space of the Backrooms, because we're ready. Neoliberalism, here we come. Oh, look at that. Under 5 minutes. Easy peasy. So we know neoliberalism, the hegemonic ideology shaping our world, is all around us. We're in the maelstrom. We know the reason for that tightness is a clear-cut content, and we know there was a rediscovery of the origins of neoliberalism. And like with every origin story, there's a time and a place. And here is that place. Beautiful. And coincidentally, the very place where Foucault delivered his lectures. However, this is actually way before that, and at that time, the time of origin of neoliberalism, the beauty of this city was probably the last thing on people's minds, because that time was the year 1938. And that was no coincidence either. You see, one part of the origin story of neoliberalism is, of course, its motivation. And that motivation was the rise of what in neoliberalism is called collectivism, as in fascism and communism. And not only was Paris sadly a fitting place in that regard, seeing as it was shortly afterwards overrun by the Nazis. That fit also goes for the timeline because, as you know, the rise of collectivism in that sense started shortly after the end of the so-called long 19th century that came to a close with World War I. And what that means in terms of ideology is that collectivism literally followed 19th century liberalism. And the question on the minds of the people who met here in 1938 was, how did that happen? How was this possible? Why, after all those liberal achievements over centuries, did we get to such a barbaric place? So as you can tell from just looking at the motivation behind neoliberalism, if that had anything to do with 19th century liberalism, it was about the latter's failure to avoid collectivism. So, in a nutshell, Paris in 1938 was the formal birthplace of neoliberalism. We'll get to what exactly that form was in a moment, but it wasn't just the ideology of neoliberalism that was created here, meaning its content, it was also the name itself. Because in the records of this meeting, we first find the term neoliberalism connoting a common agenda and a shared project. And that agenda and that project are still with us today. Also, I know it's easy to gloss over this, but seeing as the word neoliberalism today is not necessarily used as a term of endearment, as you might have noticed, I think it's worth noting that at the beginning, it was literally a self-descriptor, in that the term neoliberalism was officially coined in France in 1938, meaning at that conference. In other words, the term on which the participants agreed was neoliberalism. Okay, so we got the name covered. Now, as for the form, as you might have guessed by now, we're talking about a conference. Oh, I'm sorry, a colloquium. Well, normally I would say it's those snooty Europeans, but as you can see here, this meeting might have taken place in Europe, but when it comes to what it was about and whom, we find a distinctly American tint to it, including someone you might have heard about in various areas to boot, but not necessarily in this context. But by all means, Walter Lippmann, the guy for whom the founding conference of neoliberalism was named, consequently became the founding father of neoliberalism. And by now, meaning after the rediscovery of the origins of neoliberalism in research, that is basically a commonplace. And it gets even more astonishing because technically this title right here isn't entirely correct, because that meeting was actually about only one of Lippmann's books. That's right, one book, a book that had only been published the year prior, meaning the whole founding conference of neoliberalism was based on one book, this one. In other words, the foundational text of neoliberalism. This is the playbook of neoliberalism with all the answers we're looking for. And as I probably don't have to explain to you, the foundational text of neoliberalism had an overwhelming impact on both sides of the ocean. You don't say. I mean, it's the playbook of neoliberalism. Of course, it had an overwhelming impact, as witnessed by the fact that neoliberalism itself continues to have an overwhelming impact everywhere. Meaning, even if you don't know what's in the book yet, you'll recognize its contents, because those contents describe the very world we live in, warts and all. Now, this is actually the first moment where we encounter what we talked about in that dark side room, more specifically the distinction between figure and ground. Because while Walter Lippmann was, and still is, very present, I mean, not only was he an advisor to every single president of his adult life, in addition, we're talking over 20 books, roughly 10,000 articles, Pulitzers, yes, plural, a Peabody, a Presidential Medal of Freedom, and so on. So when Cesar Garcia writes that Walter Lippmann can arguably be considered one of the most important figures of American history in the 20th century, that's not hyperbole. And yet, when it comes to what is arguably his most consequential book, by a mile, this one, the blueprint for everything in neoliberalism, to this day, there's silence from literally all sides, meaning you can type in this in quotation marks as a direct search into YouTube, and there is not a single video dedicated to it to this day. Look for any other one of his books, not just public opinion, and you get a slew of reviews, critiques, and so on. Not this one. And it's not just the internet either. Noam Chomsky has been writing and yapping about neoliberalism, including Lippmann, for many decades. But as much as that can be said with a straight face, not once about this book. And by now, we know exactly what that means and what it doesn't. This book is in the ground, not the underground, the background, not the area of inaccessibility, but inattention. And we know what to do about that. And we'll start with its author, because one of the things that will help us understand the enormous reach neoliberalism has to this day is his reach. Here are just a couple of flashpoints in that regard. A few days after Kennedy had been buried and the foreign leaders had departed, Johnson, LBJ, telephoned Lippmann and asked if he could come over for a chat. And of course, when I read this, I thought that meant LBJ had asked Lippmann over to the White House. Turns out, half an hour later, as darkness was settling over the city, a cortege, an entourage of black limousines pulled into the driveway at Woodley Road. The president, flanked by his guards, rang the doorbell. Like I said, that was the proximity that Lippmann enjoyed with every single president, starting with Woodrow Wilson. Elon Musk is a loser, dude. And it wasn't just the domestically powerful either, in that when he traveled, as he did a part of every year, he conferred with heads of state. Often they sought him out. On a trip to Greece, for example, he jotted in his private engagement book, saw the king, the prime minister, etc., the usual people. For him, they were. Also, it wasn't just democratic leaders all over the world either. It was the powerful, period. Mussolini personally invited Lippmann to come to Italy. To his credit, he declined. And, well, once Nikita Khrushchev asked Lippmann, and of course at this point I had to take a look at this book because this just sounded so over the top. Turns out this is a prize-winning biography of Walter Lippmann. Yes, even his biography won a prize. So yeah, Nikita Khrushchev did indeed ask Lippmann if he could delay his scheduled visit to Russia for a few days because of an unexpected political crisis. Lippmann said that would be quite impossible. The Soviet leader rearranged his plans. And like I said, the enormous significance neoliberalism gained in the 20th century and counting has a lot to do with the significance of the guy for whom the whole founding conference of neoliberalism was named, and by extension, the significance of this book. I think we're ready. Let's go to that conference. Now, both in the Good Society and what was basically his keynote address, Lippmann wasted no time establishing the motivation of neoliberalism, its departure from liberalism, and the linchpins separating the two. 19th-century liberalism came to a dead end where it chose to treat property and the powers of the business corporation as, in effect, absolute and untouchable. Then it was that liberal statesmen, being unable to regulate property and corporations effectively, had to give way to the collectivists. I think we can safely assume that instead of the Wikipedia page, that's what Foucault read before referring to neoliberalism as a call to perpetual interventions. So first off, what is clear here is that Lippmann focuses on the relationship between state power and corporate power. Liberal statesmen, as he says, saw corporate power as untouchable, did not regulate corporate power effectively, and hence lost out to collectivism. And as we'll see in a moment, that issue, the relationship between state power and corporate power, is at the heart of neoliberalism to this day. And because we live in a neoliberal age, it is also at the heart of the world surrounding us to this day. That is the weird dialectic of reading this book. It is as much describing as it is carving out the world we live in. Secondly, when it comes to that relationship between the state and corporations, it isn't exactly hard to figure out what that relationship should look like from a neoliberal perspective. Again, clobbering liberalism, Lippmann says, it has been a great illusion to think of the modern business corporation as a kind of autonomous principality with inherent power derived from some mysterious source that is independent of the state. The power of the business corporation is entirely a power granted by the state. And when political theory today looks at the world we live in, that is basically a truism. Corporations are not sovereign. The source of their power is the state. And actually, it goes further than that, even beyond political theory. I don't even remember how often the Supreme Court alone has called corporations creatures of the state, sole creatures of the state, mind you, because the state has a monopoly when it comes to creating corporations. Or its opposite, for that matter. Remember this? Not too long ago, this guy saw a state judge eliminate a corporation, yes, the Trump organization, that had existed for a century at that point. Here's what happened. The ruling yanks the corporate charter in 2 short paragraphs. That's brutal, man. Another good corporation gone, pending appeal. And not just that one, of course. Here's another one, a famous one, the East India Company, one of the most powerful corporations ever created by the United Kingdom and eliminated by the UK Parliament on June 1st, 1874. No appeals pending. The state and only the state can create and eliminate a corporation that is and remains part of our neoliberal world. And the power of the business corporation is indeed entirely a power granted by the state. But of course, that power asymmetry was there long before neoliberalism. What sets the latter apart from its liberal predecessor is the explicit stipulation that the state should use that power asymmetry, and the equally explicit criticism of free market liberalism for not having done that. Corporations are legal creatures. It is therefore misleading to think of them as existing somehow outside the law and then to ask whether it is permissible to interfere with them. Corporate organizations of any kind exist only because there are certain rights and immunities which can be enforced by enlisting the coercive authority of the state. To speak of letting things alone, liberalism, literally laissez-faire, to speak of letting things alone is, therefore, to use a meaningless and deceptive phrase. Wow, that's neoliberalism. That's the founder of neoliberalism in the Playbook of neoliberalism on 19th century liberalism. So, how's that neoliberalism is just a neoliberalism narrative from before holding up? There is no letting things alone in neoliberalism. That's what Foucault alluded to earlier when he referred to it as a call to perpetual interventions. There's no free market in neoliberalism. There's not supposed to be a free market in neoliberalism, or a free society for that matter, because what we've established so far is that neoliberalism argues for an iron grip on the part of the state when it comes to corporations, all corporations. And as before, its implicit criticism of laissez-faire liberalism is actually not that implicit. It is plain that a corporation enjoys great advantages as against unincorporated individuals. All of these advantages are created and maintained by the law. How can such rights be regarded as inalienable and immutable? Is it not evident that in granting the privilege of incorporation, the state may fix the conditions, that it may say what the rights of an incorporated body are, that it may say that the privilege of limited liability shall be enjoyed only insofar as the corporation meets certain specific obligations? And that grip, from the neoliberal perspective, should not only be tight, but also explicit. A charter of incorporation is a state-created privilege. There is, therefore, no reason why that charter should be vague and general. It can be made as specific in its definition of what rights the corporation may exercise and what duties it must perform as the lawmakers choose to make it. In the charter and in the statutes governing corporations, they can stipulate any public policy they deem desirable. Let's put a pin in that last part. Also, at that conference, there actually were a couple of dyed-in-the-wool 19th-century liberals, famous ones to boot, like Hayek and Mises. The thing is that after Lippmann's opening speech, they hardly said a peep, because even at this point, they could clearly see where this was going. Neoliberalism was not going to be a redux of liberalism. It was not going to be laissez-faire. It was not going to be free market. It was going to be the opposite. And while some of them sat through it in silence, others, like Mises, just left. The thing is that, so far, we've seen neoliberalism delineate the relationship between state power and corporate power. But of course, neoliberalism isn't just the ideology shaping the corporate world. It's shaping our world. So where do we come into play here, in society, where we live? How does neoliberalism impact our lives? Well, let's go back to our pin here and look at that again. In the charter and in the statutes governing corporations, they, the lawmakers, can stipulate any public policy they deem desirable. Oh, there it is. The state's ultimate goal is, of course, not the control of corporate power per se. The latter is a tool. That's the idea, the neoliberal idea. And how does the world around us today look like in that regard? Corporations are a fundamental part of how the state continues to govern social life. The state governs through corporations. Corporations are an integral part of, here it comes, the political setup through which the state governs. And again, that does not just go to corporate action, it goes to corporate existence, because the objectives for which a corporation is created are universally such as the government wishes to promote. All over society, all over our lives, and individually, meaning in every single segment of society, every institution, first and foremost, of course, the marketplace. Meaning corporations are not creatures of the private market, but governmental colonizers of it. The state places corporations all over society, including the marketplace. This is David Sipley, by the way, a fellow political scientist, and he also makes that last point very clear. Corporations are political tools because the corporate form is not a business technology, but a governance technology. Corporations are not an outgrow of the marketplace. If anything, there is a rift between the market and corporate power. You would never get a corporation emerging from a free market society, because corporations don't come from the market, or society for that matter. They come from the state. And just when it comes to the market, there is a slew of literature on what David says here, the incompatibility of corporate power with the market. The fundamental paradox of any corporation is that even though it competes in the marketplace, it uses non-market instruments, plans, commands, controls, meaning power, to accomplish its goals. Well, by now we know it's actually not a paradox, at least from a neoliberal perspective, Because the concentration of control does not come from the mechanization of industry, it comes from the state. Because corporate power comes from the state. Actually, corporate capitalism comes from the state, not from the marketplace. Because the assumption that great corporate capitalism is in some mysterious way the inexorable consequence of machinery is an illusion. Just like no single corporation grew in the marketplace, corporate power writ large is of extraneous origin, meaning without the privileges and immunities of the corporate form, the industrial system as we know it could not have developed and could not exist. The form of corporate capitalism we live in and under is completely a state creation, and the failure to look at the state when dealing with corporate power means that some people are stuck with this question right here, forever, because there is no other source. Corporations are both creations and tools of the state in our neoliberal world, and from a corporate perspective, that means that its prime mover is always political in nature, because the corporation's most important feature is the relation to the power that created it, not its relation to the part of society it has been placed in, for instance, the marketplace. And from the state's perspective, the rationale isn't economic in nature either. The prime mover is power, not money. Hence, there are many business enterprises which would have to be perpetuated even if they were run at a loss. 2008, anyone? Or 2020, for that matter? Or AI? And in an earlier publication, Lippmann elaborates on that point. The real news about business is that it is being administered by men who are not profiteers, because they are political agents, not economic ones. I mean, by now, a huge majority of IPOs happen in the red. There are whole industries that have run themselves into the ground by openly taking political stances. These are very obviously men who are not profiteers, but state operatives. And before we get to us in society, there is one last point that becomes very clear from a neoliberal perspective. Actually, it's more like a direct conclusion from everything we've just looked at. Because, of course, the state doesn't just have corporations at its disposal. It's also using its own agencies, literally state agencies. And based on what we just looked at, the distinction is thin between the business corporation on the one hand and the subordinate public agencies on the other. Both exist because of legal rights established and enforced by the state. The business corporation by virtue of its charter and the laws of corporation, the social agency by virtue of an enabling statute. They are two means of collective action, with one agent, the state. Hence, both the business corporation and the social service are, in effect, agencies created in order to conduct certain collective affairs of a community. In both cases, again, by the state. And what that means in our neoliberal world is that any sharp distinction between constitutional state and corporation is untenable. Corporations are low-key state agencies. They are, to use an expression by the great Jim Scott, infra-political. Like infrared, they stay beneath the threshold of being recognized as political. And the answer to the question as to why that is, finally, brings us, well, to us in society. A society that, just like our lives, is being ruled by the neoliberal ideology. So why does the state not openly declare corporations as what they are, which is state agencies? Well, here to nudge us in the right direction is University of Michigan professor Elizabeth Anderson, who has this to say on the issue. About half of U.S. employees have been subject to suspicionless drug screening by their employers. Millions are pressured by their employers to support particular political causes or candidates. So far, no breaking news, but here it comes. If the U.S. government imposed such regulations on us, we would rightly protest that our constitutional rights were being violated. In other words, the Bill of Rights runs out at the company gate. And there's your answer. That's why the state doesn't label its corporations as the agencies they are. This works, this only works because the corporation is the state's shadow. And in that shadow, the light of constitutional rights and constraints doesn't shine. And as long as the connection between that shadow and the object throwing it is not made, none of this is going to change. Nonetheless, this obviously doesn't just concern the relationship between state power and corporate power anymore. This is us in society. And what that means is that in society, all around us, is not just corporate power. That is actually state power, infra-political state power, meaning the state extends to the corporation for purposes the state approves under procedures it prescribes. And that's no coincidence, of course, because the end goal of the state is not to rule over corporations, it's to use corporations to rule over us. And so, as University of Georgia professor Joshua Barkan explains, corporations became the very basis for regulating conduct. And with corporations as de facto state agencies in mind, here's how Barkan elaborates on that point. The corporation as police. Let that sink in for a moment. Just that phrase. The corporation as police was conceptualized as a threshold establishing the limits of direct state power, meaning state power restrained by the Constitution. Corporations were given exceptional powers to manage, direct, and channel the conduct of the corporate body, its individual members like employees, and the lives of whole populations. Does this sound and feel in any way familiar to you? That's the neoliberal world. That's our world. This is what neoliberalism was criticizing liberalism for not having done. It was never just about regulating the conduct of corporations. It was, and is, about regulating our conduct. Corporate power is a tool to regulate our world, including, if you remember our cozy dark side room, the regulation of what we are being shown in this world, all around us, on the corporate surface, the inescapable corporate surface, in the figure, our area of attention. Which brings us full circle to the beginning of our little trip through the Backrooms, when we looked at a slew of sources, all telling us that neoliberalism was basically just today's form of liberalism. Laissez-faire, free market, nothing stateside to see here. And at this point, I think you can already guess what all of those sources have in common. That's right, they're all corporate publications, including the Wikimedia Corporation with its surface segment named Wikipedia, all telling us that neoliberalism has nothing to do with the state. And because we live in a neoliberal world, that means what's happening in our world, in society, doesn't have anything to do with the state. It's all evil corporations. No need to look beyond that. Don't you dare. In a nutshell, the public discourse is full of BS stories about neoliberalism because neoliberalism is all about controlling the one form of power on whose surface those BS stories appear. I told you nothing is as good as power at hiding its own tracks. And while we're on the part of corporate power that has been placed in the media segment of society, the corporate media, upon hearing that the founder of neoliberalism, considering what neoliberalism is, upon hearing that Walter Lippmann is widely acknowledged as the father of modern American journalism, and after that, looking at this corporate takeover of journalism and the corporate media explosion, this is probably not going to come as a surprise to anybody. Oh my God, how did journalism become corporate in a neoliberal age? And what could it possibly mean that Walter Lippmann is the father of modern journalism? Ask nobody ever again. And don't get me wrong, I fully understand that from the perspective of society, from our perspective, it's easy to lose sight of that connection between state power and corporate power. It's easy to focus on the figure and not see the ground, because we're not supposed to. And from the perspective of a nail, the hammer coming down on it is admittedly much closer and more visible than the hand holding it. Which brings us to the appendix room, because there is one more thing we have to talk about when it comes to neoliberalism, something you might have noticed during this video, more and more actually, because the mere fact that neoliberalism is obviously far removed from anything connected to laissez-faire, free market liberalism also means it isn't compatible with the general understanding of what capitalism is. I mean, the overwhelmingly important role the state plays in neoliberalism alone should give that away. And yeah, the question as to what form of capitalism this neoliberal world actually showcases is absolutely valid. But what all of that also means is that neoliberalism seems to be a lot closer than expected to socialism. So much so that some of the salty free market liberals in 1938 called neoliberalism the little brother of socialism, which obviously begs the question, if they're so close, why is neoliberalism running circles around Marxism when it comes to relevance and political influence, in spite of having been around so much shorter? And before we answer that question, by way of a brief disclaimer, kind of like when we talked about religion, let me just say this. Not only am I myself neither a Marxist nor an anti-Marxist, I actually consider both impossible. I don't know about your eyesight, but if we put up the collected works of Marx and Engels right in front of us, volume 1, volume 2, and so on, at least I couldn't see the last one because that would be volume 150. I have read thousands of pages of Marx and Engels, and I'm probably still just scratching at the 5% mark. And that's just the quantitative side of things. As you may know, unlike many other famous authors, like, say, Wittgenstein, Marx didn't restrict himself to one topic. And as a self-proclaimed student of Hegel's, that would have been impossible. And throughout his writings, there are absolutely brilliant things, like pretty much everything he wrote in France, the philosophical anthropological manuscripts, or his argument about the market as a fetish in The Capital. But as you would expect in an opus as big as a house, there's also bad stuff. And the example that is most relevant to our topic tonight is this. The totality of these, meaning capitalist relations of production, constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure. From the get, Marx reduces politics to a mere derivative on a very fundamental level because, as you can see, this is not a social or even epistemological statement, but an ontological one. And no one has ever declared a part of the world an irrelevant superstructure and then went on to develop a theory about it, let alone a useful one. So, not only is there no Marxist theory of the state, not only has there never been a Marxist theory of the state, because of what you see in front of you right now, there can never be a Marxist theory of the state. And in a neoliberal world that not only rests on the connection between state power and corporate power, but in which the sovereign state has become the overwhelming force in any given scenario, a world in which state power extends itself into society via corporate power. In a world like that, separating society and the state, apart from declaring the latter a mere reflex of what's happening in society, will obviously not let you see, let alone understand, the power structure of the world we live in. But don't take it from me. Here is arguably the greatest Marxist theorist of the 20th century. From Canada, Miss Ellen Wood. Marxists have generally adopted modes of analysis which treat the economic base and the legal, political, and ideological superstructures as qualitatively different spheres. There has been a tendency to perpetuate the rigid conceptual separation of the economic and the political, so that all-important state-corporate nexus from a Marxist perspective is simply invisible, meaning the state, from a Marxist perspective, remains a blind spot. And don't get me wrong, when it comes to the things happening in society, for many decades, the only people warning about the dangers of corporate power were people on the left, and I'm still with them on that. But when it comes to asking where all that power and those insane privileges are coming from, they're nowhere to be found. Of course, as we've learned together in the dark, what is made visible to us in the figure on the power surface is meant to not let you see that connection. That connection is in the ground, because nobody in power, especially state power, has any interest in putting that connection into the figure, the area of attention. From the perspective of the state and its representatives, you want that attention on society and society only. So when you're a representative of the state, a state that uses corporations in society, then considering what those corporations are actually doing to people, as someone who represents the state, you want the attention on corporate power. You want corporate power to take the brunt of the backlash coming from society. You want to give Mark Zuckerberg $23 million every year for his personal security detail. You want that. Why? Because you know what would happen if that connection was made. And the backlash would go from the representatives of corporate power to the representatives of state power. And you don't want that. Trust me on this. So by all means, looking at our neoliberal world through a Marxist lens predictably is going to fail. And I'm not saying that to be mean, but because I care about understanding our world, especially the power in it. Just to give you one example. Yes, it's frequent flyer and somehow still friend of the show, Noam Chomsky again. So we're not going for the low-hanging fruit here. And as I mentioned before, he talks about neoliberalism all the time. And by now, we know the role the state plays in neoliberalism. And it shows. The state has ballooned in size over the decades. The United States alone, a country that is 250 years old, has 450 federal agencies, by which I mean officially declared federal agencies. The neoliberal state is becoming bigger and stronger by the day, which through the ideological lens of neoliberalism makes all the sense in the world. Yet when Chomsky looks at this world, our world, through his Marxist lens, this is what he sees. The neoliberal Washington consensus calls for the minimization of the state. I'm sorry, but that is absurd, both theoretically and empirically. Yet again, still very consistent with the Marxist perspective. So let's just say he's not alone in that regard. So what we need is a neo-Marxist overhaul that recognizes the state, political power, as a significant factor and actor in the world, in society. I'm looking forward to that. Wow, what a journey. Who would have thought there was so much substance in these liminal spaces? I hope you feel the same way. Of course, there are still a lot of issues we had to leave behind today, including so much about state power and corporate power, which just means we have a lot to come back to. So for now, thank you so much for watching. It means a lot to me. Stay strong in this neoliberal hellhole, and I hope to see you in the next one.
And I want to begin with my hero, Pierre Clost, who wrote a book called Society Against the State. And I'm going to quote the last two sentences of his book. He writes, quote, "It is said that the history of peoples who have a history is the history of class struggle. It might be said with at least as much truthfulness that the history of peoples without history is the history of their struggle against the state."